Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Milanovic, it's a true honor to introduce the keynote today, which is to be given by someone who doesn't really need an introduction, I would say, because Professor Milanovic, who is at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, has been everywhere and has fulfilled all kinds of functions. But most importantly, he has recently published two overwhelmingly important books on global inequality, the latest being Capitalism Alone and Global Inequality, the preceding volume, both of which are actually page turners. So this is something that is highly unusual of scientific literature, should we say? So they really make an impact not only through the insights that they offer, but also through the way how they are written, which is an immense achievement, and which obviously strikes to the heart of what we're interested in here in Budapest. And Professor Milanovic probably would think, how come CEU is still here in Hungary? Well, the university has been kicked out, but we kind of stay. So by agreeing to give a keynote to us, you actually help to upset the unfortunate plans of the government over here to make sure that there is no trace of CEU intellectual activity in the heart of Budapest. So we're overwhelmingly grateful to you, and we're looking forward to learning from you. Thank you very much, Professor Milanovic.
Thank you very much for such a beautiful introduction, Dimitry. I'm, of course, extremely honored and delighted to be virtually in Budapest. I would have preferred to be there in person. I've been many times to Budapest. I actually have very good memories, private visits, then of course also work-related visits when I was working for the World Bank, and I have many very good friends who certainly would have taken me for coffee or dinner had I been in Budapest. But I think we have to live with the situation as it is, and I'm also very happy that you are still in the heart of Budapest, as Dimitry said. Now, I will give a presentation which is based, as Dimitry said, on my two books, Global Inequality and Capitalism Alone, but they will be a little bit mixed up because obviously the presentation would be about 30 to 35 minutes, and I really would like you also to have a chance to ask questions afterwards or to make comments. So as the title says here, I would speak first about income inequality. I will start actually from very, far away from the about 2 centuries ago. And then of course I would move into the past 3 decades where actually lots of changes have happened. And then I would like, hopefully we will not run out of time, I would like to say a few words about inequality in advanced economies and in China. So this is the structure of the talk. So let me now go to, if I can get the PowerPoint to work. It's okay, here it is. So before I go to this watershed years, let me just, as I said before, I wanted to say a few words about the evolution of global inequality in the last 2 centuries. That's quite important. I have a very nice slide to that, but I didn't include it here in order to save time. Obviously, our estimates of global inequality since 1820 are somewhat, somewhat of a guesswork, but we do have very good data on GDP per capita from Madison's project, and we have some estimates of inequalities in a number of countries based on social tables. So I would also encourage many young students who are here to look actually at possibilities of making social tables, which means listing the main socioeconomic groups or classes with their incomes, which can be, I'm sure, done for Hungary in the 18th, well, certainly in the 19th century. So what do we find then? We find that after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we have had a very significant period of rising global inequality for more than a century. Why did global inequality rise? There are 2 reasons. The first, the big reason, was that the developed countries, or actually the countries that were then becoming developed, like Northwestern Europe and then the United States and later Japan, have of course become much richer, whereas two other countries or almost civilizations, India and China, have either stagnated or in case of China, gone down. So that has created a very significant gap in relative incomes. And then on top of that, within many of those nations, particularly England and the United States, inequality within countries has risen as well. So you have had two forces driving inequality up in the 19th century and all the way to the World War I. Rising differences between nations, as we know, the West was much superior economically, politically, socially to the rest of the world, especially Asia. Obviously, I don't need to remind you about colonialism, the Opium Wars, conquest of India, and so forth. Then, during most of the 20th century, inequality remained extremely high, with the large gaps between different parts of the world. That's when we had the first world, which was the world of the rich capitalist countries, the second world, the world of socialist countries that was poorer, and finally the third world, which was even poorer, of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Now, why do I actually have this introduction? Because I want to highlight the fact that we are now in the third phase of this long-term development, and that third phase starts exactly at the time of 1978 to 1990. You can read the slide. These are all events that happened and that you know. And from that point onward, the rise of China, and then later the rise of India and other Asian countries like Thailand, Vietnam, even more recently Bangladesh, has reduced the gaps between Asia and the West. And that has contributed to the reduction in global inequality for the first time in 2 centuries. Now, the current crisis and COVID might have different effects. So I will come to that later, but let me just once summarize that we really had 3 big periods in the last 200 years. A period of rising inequality driven by the sort of industrial revolution and enrichment of the West, with stagnation of the poor countries. Then a period where these 3 different parts of the world really had very different levels of income and very high inequality worldwide. And then the period of the rise of Asia, which is kind of a mirror image of what happened in the 19th century with the rise of the West, except the rise of Asia is now reducing global inequality. So let's then go into what happened in the last 3 decades, because that's our main interest. Now, you can read on this slide things, as I said before, with which you are familiar. Of course, some of us who are older might even remember them. But the point is that within 10 years, about 60% of the world population started living under very different economic system and even political system than before. So these were really the watershed years whose effects, I believe, we still feel today. Now, what was one of the effects on incomes? As I mentioned before, that was the rise of China, and that was the emergence of something that you might call a global middle class. I have here the numbers from 2011. Actually, I have more recent numbers that I didn't put here for 2018. I'll show you that in a minute. But the basic story is as follows. You have the blue line, which gives you the distribution of income. This is the usual distribution function that actually plots on the horizontal axis income level. It is in log, and it's in annual real income expressed in purchasing power parity dollars, which means that in principle, those dollars are of equal purchasing power in any country. So you adjust for the price level in India, which is low, compared to Norway, for example, where it is high. You actually adjust for that. Now, as you notice, the blue line from 1988 has a very high concentration of people who are relatively poor, who are below $1,000 per year in terms of their income. You also notice that in the line from 1988, there is actually no thickness in this line in the middle. The big change 30 years later is that, or actually in this case 20 plus years later, is that you do have thickness in the middle. And for those who have studied income distribution, the red line, which is now global income distribution, does resemble, not fully, but does resemble the general distributions that you find for individual countries. Distribution of income is often approximated by log normal distribution, and this does seem somewhat log normal. You know, the horizontal axis is in log terms, and the distribution doesn't look exactly normal because it is still asymmetric a little bit. As you can see, the upper tail is longer than the upper right tail is longer than the left, but it does resemble. So the world actually has changed in these 20 or 30 years by really creating something which did not have before. And this is something which I prefer to call median class. Sometimes call it middle, but you know, by Western standards, that middle class is still relatively poor. Now, how did it come around? It came around through the rise of Asia, which since 1980s was very significant. Now, look, for example, on the fact on the left hand, you have the comparison of the GDP, total GDP. This is not per capita, obviously, but total GDP of China versus the United States. In purchasing power terms, China overtook the United States sometime around 2015. And you notice also that there was beginning of this sort of overtaking, of beginning of a faster growth rate of China around 1980. The graph shows percentage of the total world GDP that is produced by China versus the US. As you can see, in both cases, they are producing a little bit below 20% of the global GDP in PPP terms. You will notice also a very anomalous position just after World War II that the United States was producing alone 40% of GDP. That was, of course, a very special situation where Europe was destroyed, Japan was destroyed, China was in utter poverty, India, it was super poor, Africa was, you know, destitute. So obviously in that case, the percentage that the US was producing was enormous, and that percentage is not going to come back. Now, the other graph is also interesting. It shows you the positions of the same idea, percentage of global GDP, India and Germany. Notice again the fact that India has actually been declining in its share in global GDP from practical independence up to 1980, and then of course starts growing very significantly and overtakes Germany fairly dramatically. So obviously the units on the left-hand side axis are not the same for these two graphs. You know, the India's contribution to global GDP is about 8%. Germany's is a little bit below 4%. US and China around 20%. So this is really what is actually behind that creation of the global middle class. But that creation of the global middle class also meant that global inequality since about year 2000, or even actually earlier, probably 1995 approximately, has started declining. I want to mention that very clearly because we are, of course, here, many of you are here and are interested in inequality because of inequality increase. And indeed, in most countries of the world, if you look OECD data, for example, for the rich countries, I think like 29 out of 33 countries have had an increase in inequality within countries in the last 30 years. Even countries like Sweden, which used to be the exemplars of equality, have had a significant increase in inequality. Norway, likewise. The Netherlands, obviously the United States, the UK, Germany, Spain. So we are really sort of adjusted or expecting always an increase in inequality. But at the world level, the opposite process took shape because of the fact that relatively poor countries like India and China, which are large, that's important. You know, if you have a small country that is growing fast, it's not going to make much of a difference to the global income inequality. But when you have 2.7 billion people with rates of growth which are significantly higher than the rates of growth of the rich world, they of course go through the income distribution up and they reduce gaps. And that's what happened. the Gini coefficient of the world, which was 30 years ago, somewhere around 70, which is extremely high Gini coefficient. We don't have any individual country, not even South Africa has a Gini of 70. That has been reduced to a Gini of 62. So that was actually what happened up to 1918. After that, and I will talk about that very briefly at the end because we don't have the numbers yet, but after that, the situation might have changed. But before COVID, there was, for 30 years, there was significant decline of global inequality. Now, that decline was not kind of a random decline. That decline was driven, as you can see here, by this midpoint. Now, what this graph shows you, it shows you percentile of global income distribution on the bottom, on the horizontal axis. So number one would be the lowest percentile in the world. This is actually done by the 5 percentiles. So the lowest number would be, the number most on the left would be the bottom 5 percentiles in the world. And the vertical axis shows you the increase in real income, again, adjusted for the differences in price level. So it's a real income. Adjusted for the consumer price index locally, plus adjusted for the difference between price levels in different countries. So shows your increase in real income over the period 1988 to 2008. This became known as the elephant chart. It was quoted, as you probably seen that very often, but it's quoted for a good reason, because it shows you first that very poor people did not really have much of an increase. And then as you move towards the middle of the income distribution, towards the point which I called, for simplicity, China's middle class, you had very significant increase of about 70 to 80% in real terms. Actually, if you look at individual Chinese deciles, they increased much more, because this is the average number of everybody who was at that particular position in the global income distribution. And Chinese urban deciles increased 200 or even 300% over these 20 years. So if I were to show them, they would actually go practically through the graph. You would not be able to see them. They would actually be somewhere in the ceiling. But then the next point, and that's why the graph attracted so much attention, is this point here, is that you come to people who are around the 80th percentile in the global income distribution, which means they're relatively well-off people. They are richer than what you might call Asian middle class. The Asian middle class is still significantly poorer than the European middle class. And then if you look at those people, and there you have 3 large countries with very little real growth among that lower part of their own income distribution. And they were the United States, Japan, and Germany. So, these 3 countries have about 500 million people, and lower parts of their income distributions represent 250 million people. And these people had pretty mediocre period of globalization. The increases, I can now remember, the US, I think, was about 12%, Japan was -1%, and Germany was somewhere in between, maybe 6 or 7% real growth over 20 years. So it was actually significantly below 1% per annum per capita. And this is the contrast between these two that attracted attention, and probably, one can argue, was behind some of the satisfaction with globalization in rich countries. In other words, it does not really require somebody to be, a physics professor or to have an IQ of 150 to realize that if you look at this slide, that globalization seems to be actually very good for middle classes in Asia who were poor, but they are becoming richer, and was not good at all for the middle classes in Europe that actually didn't gain anything. If you were to show this slide to Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, they would not have been happy with that slide, because their idea of globalization was, of course, to sell globalization that which would be good for the middle classes of the rich countries. They were not interested necessarily how China would do in a globalization, or India. But as you can see, the things have changed, and they have turned out the way that the slide shows. And then on top of that, at the very end of this, on the right-hand side, you see the group of the top 1% that has done extremely well. And in terms of percentages, it almost gained as much as the people in the middle. But in absolute amounts, it gained much more because the people at the top percentile have an income which is many-fold higher than the income of the China's middle class. So if in percentage terms they gain approximately the same, obviously the absolute amounts that were gained by the top of the income distribution were huge. So this is essentially the situation that we are facing still today, although I will show you that it has become somewhat less dramatic after the financial crisis. But this is the situation where every politician, and I will not go into all these political details now, but every politician in a rich country basically has the following choice. Do I actually look towards the left, toward the China's middle class, and try to change the rules of globalization in such a way so that my own middle class, which is there, with no growth, would actually grow faster and China would grow slower? Or do I actually ignore that part of the graph and focus on the part of the graph between my middle class and my top 1%, which then requires within national policy changes, increase in taxation, more progressive taxation, increase in the importance of the public education, and so forth. So this is a basic choice. If you want to really make it very, very sort of basic, the choice for the rich countries, it's either we change the rule of globalization so that it's better for us and thereby sort of probably worse for China, or do we actually continue with globalization, but do policies of internal income redistribution? In other words, do we tax, quote unquote, China, or do we tax our home rich? And this is something that, of course, as you have seen very clearly in the United States, has been at the forefront of a political discussion. You can say that Trump has actually used this anti-China policy as a way, as he believed, to improve the position of the middle class in the US. With Biden, it's a little bit different because he's actually trying to do measures within the country to actually reduce inequality, but also to keep, maybe for different political and other reasons, also to be not as friendly to China as was the case in the past. But really, I think this illustrates the political dilemma quite well. So what happened then after the financial crisis? This is the same graph as before. This is called growth incidence curve because it shows you the gain in percentage terms at every point in the distribution. You notice still the middle, which means essentially Asian countries, has done very well, but the bottom hasn't done very well. I'm sorry, not the bottom, but the highest part of the income distribution in the world, the top 1%, hasn't done very well because they basically have been affected by the crisis. So the elephant curve, which we have seen before, had this trunk, which was really high up. Well, now the trunk after the financial crisis really got cut off because the financial crisis affected particularly Euro-American, or actually that was really the Atlantic financial crisis, and it affected people at the top. But as you notice, it did not affect growth of Asian countries. Now, so continued very strong growth around the global median, no improvement for the Western middle classes. So really they are still at very low rates of growth. And then finally, slowdown of the global 1% growth. So that was after the previous crisis. Now, we are now facing a new crisis that I will say a few words later. But let me show you, for example, to give you an idea, who are the people who are in the global top 1%? You say, well, these are, richest people, this is the data from household surveys. So the people who are in a global top 1% are really rich people, but they are not billionaires. They are not the Forbes list because simply this is based on surveys. People who are in the global Forbes are very few, and they are never going to participate, nor will the Russian oligarchs participate here, nor would, rich people from China. So don't take this as a representation of the oligarchies or plutocracies, because these people who are very top, of whom probably we are talking about several thousand only, they are not going to participate in the service. However, who will be there are really very well-off people in many countries who could be, involved with high-tech financial sector, doctors, lawyers, software designers, all the occupations that do pretty well. So if you look at that, you noticed, of course, still a great advantage in terms of real income, and particularly because of inequality in the distribution of the United States. So about 1/3 of the people in the top 1% are from the United States, followed by China and Japan. Actually, China has probably now overtaken Japan as the second most important. So this is number of people in millions. The top 1% has about 70 million people, because I don't have the information for the entire world, which is almost now 7.8 billion people, but I have information about 7 billion people. And so you have about 31 million from the United States in the top 1%, and then about 3 to 4 million from China and Japan. And then you notice there are actually other countries, including Brazil, France, Australia, Mexico, and so on, with 1 or 2 million. Russia with 3 million. So again, these are not oligarchs from Russia. These are actually well-off people, of the occupations that I mentioned before. So what is then, of course, interesting is to realize that the following thing is that actually when you put people from different countries of the world in the global income distribution, you realize something that you don't see when you look only at within national distributions. So let me explain this graph, which actually many people like, but it's a little bit complex at first. Now, on the horizontal axis, I take percentiles of country income distribution. So let's suppose I didn't have here, although I could actually send you the graph for Hungary. So let's suppose I interview somebody today, and he or she tells me I'm at the 50th percentile. We calculate it and we say, oh, well, this is your income. You're at the 50th percentile in Hungarian income distribution. That would be exactly on the horizontal axis where the red line is drawn. This broken dashed red line is at the 50. So then I ask that person, I could ask you now when you think about this. Okay, you are just in the middle of the Hungarian income distribution. Now, do you think you would be above the middle of the global income distribution, or maybe exactly at the middle, or maybe you're going to be higher? No, then you have to start thinking, well, is Hungary a rich country? How many people are in Hungary? And then I think that actually, if you think straight, you would say, well, I would expect to be, let's suppose, at the 75th percentile in the global income distribution. I have not actually looked the numbers. I may be a few percentiles off, but I would expect Hungary to be, as I said, maybe 75th, maybe 80th percentile in the world, simply because Hungary is relatively rich compared to the world as a whole. So that's where I would actually put that dot for Hungary. Now, I've done this here for the US, and you will see a couple of other countries. And what you notice here is that first, the person who is at the median income level in the US is at something like 90th percentile in the world. So the person who is in the middle of the US income distribution is very rich. He or she is richer than 90% of the people in the world. And even when you look at a person who is at the very bottom of the US income distribution, obviously these are not homeless, they are not included, but people who really have a home, have an address actually where you go, they are actually around 55th to 60th percentile of the global income distribution. And then you also look at the very top, and what do you notice there is that more than 10% of the US population is at the global top 1%. So, the ambivalence of the slogan, which was used 10 years ago, we are 99%, becomes very clear here. When they were using that slogan, then meant, well, the Wall Street is the top 1% within the United States, but we are the 99%. But these people globally, many of them, were in the global 1%. So people who were demonstrated then were, significant part of them were really at the top of the global income distribution because they lived in a rich country and they were relatively high up in the distribution of that rich country. You had to be 89th percentile in the US, and you would be still the part of the global 1% because 11% of the Americans, as I said, are the part of the global top 1%. And then to give you an idea how different parts of the world look like, here is China urban, which, as you can see, is clearly catching up with the United States. And it's certainly catching up at the very top because you have a significant percentage of Chinese who are also in the global top 1%. But of course, at any other point of the distribution, the gap is still significant. You take the person with the median income in China, the gap is 20 percentage points. Now, what does it mean, 20 percentage points? That means if you were to line up everybody in the world, between the median income person in China and the median person in the US, you would have something like 1.4 billion people. So they are not close by incomes, yet. They might become closer as China continues its very high growth. But China is de facto like almost two countries. So rural China is much poorer than urban China. The gap between the two is actually over, depending what you use, GDP per capita or household service, is between 2 and 3 times. You do notice that actually there are some people in rural China who are also doing pretty well. They are towards the top of the global income distribution, but there are also people in rural China on the bottom, if you look at the bottom left corner, who are just at the 10th percentile. So they're extremely poor. You don't find people that poor, for example, in Europe. And then I will show you here urban India, which interestingly is still poorer than rural China. And of course, at the top, you have also rural India also joining at the, very rich people at the top. But look at the bottom. That's actually the rural India people. I mean, people in rural India, significant percentage of them are really at the bottom of the world. They're like even the 2nd or 3rd or 4th percentile in the global income distribution, where actually you find many very poor people from Africa as well. And this is India rural. I'm saying India rural now, which is of course even poorer than urban India. And again, at the very bottom, it's really the bottom part of the world. And a final country that I would like to show you is a country that spans the world with really poor people at the bottom and really rich people at the top and a significant middle class, and that's Brazil. I could have used here South Africa. You would have had more or less the same sort of graph, actually, because South Africa is a very highly unequal country, and you have to be very highly unequal in order to basically mimic the world, to have representation among the poorest people in the world and the richest people in the world. And if I had Russia here, it would look more or less like the urban China, so there's not much difference there. And if I had rich West European countries like the Netherlands, they would be above the US in the lower part of the income distribution, and then they would actually fall below the US by 1 or 2 percentiles in the top income distribution. In other words, when you compare United States with West European countries, poorer people in the US are worse off than, for example, poor people in Germany, but the better off people in the US are better off than their equivalent people in Germany. So what are the most important probable developments? I think that's quite important to realize that for the first time in the 2 centuries, Western lower middle classes may not be in the global top quintile. Now, we have become used to that the West was richer, but if you look at it historically, it was somewhat anomaly because that much greater wealth of the Western world lasted about 3 centuries and probably would come to an end within the 21st century. In other words, more and more rich Asians would be populating the global top quintile and global top decile and even global top percentile. it does have a psychological and a consumption effect. It has a psychological effect that I recently saw, for example, in a new book by Paul Collier, who actually talks with some, sort of melancholy and about the fact that England was much more equal, when he was growing up in the 60s and the 70s, but also English incomes of the working class in England were much higher than the incomes of people in the third world. Well, of course, what he doesn't sort of realize is that was possible only because people in the third world were poor. Well, but the relative positions will change. So what will happen is that even if your income in England or France does not fall in real terms, you would be overtaken by people from Asia whose incomes are increasing, and your relative position, because this is a relative position here that I'm talking about, these are like percentiles, would actually shift down. So it might have a psychological effect to the extent that you know what is your position, but you might not know that. But it will have also a consumption effect. You may not have anymore in 30 or 40 years European very cheap, for example, travel or vacations in poorer countries, particularly in Asia. At some point, Thailand might become for an average German like what Norway is for him. In other words, it could become a fairly expensive place to go to vacation. So it does have effects both psychologically and on consumption if you have this reshuffling of income. And actually, this is the biggest reshuffling of income since the Industrial Revolution, so in the last 200 years. Furthermore, if you look at this, you will actually have, which we already see now, a rich Atlantic and the Pacific coasts. But when you look at the Eurasian landmass, the central part of the Eurasian landmass, Russia and Central Asia, it seems, would remain relatively poor compared to the Pacific coast of China and, of course, to the Western Europe. And that would also create problems, whether it is migration or other problems. And then finally, a very huge and increasing gap between Europe and Africa, because Africa is now really the key part of the world that would determine whether convergence will continue or not, simply because Africa is the only continent that first did not converge in terms of its real income towards the Western nations, and secondly, is the only part of the world with a large increase in population coming in the next 50 years. So the ratio between, I think, in population between Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and the European Union would be something 4:1 to 5:1. So if you have 4 times as many people whose per capita income is 1/10 of the income that they can make in Europe, it's very obvious that you would have incredibly strong forces for migration, including the fact also that many Africans speak European languages, obviously French and English. They have had long-standing cultural links. So I think the issue of African migration is something that is a problem that Europe is not going to face from one summer to another. It's a problem that Europe is going to face for the next century or even 2 centuries. And I don't want to go into this issue, but I think it's a major issue for Europe because, as you know, Europe for the last 500 years has been a continent that was exporting people. In this case, it's actually a continent that needs to import people. So what are the likely effects? And I think actually, okay, I'm sort of taking too much time. What are the likely effects of COVID-19? First of all, we really have hard time telling what are the effects. First, because COVID-19 is not over. We are still probably in the midst of what is happening. And secondly, the effects are so uneven that whether you look at the situation 6 months ago or possibly situation 6 months from today, different countries have performed very different. At first, actually, and that was Deaton's paper, rich countries have had high mortality rate and greater declines in GDP. So that would actually imply that poorer countries would actually to somehow catching up and global inequality would continue going down. But then the problem was that India had an extremely bad period last year and very bad period now. And India is almost 1.4 billion people. So that if 1.4 billion people had negative growth of 10%, that really has a significant impact on global inequality. On the other hand, China has continued with high growth rates. And now what is interesting, and I think I'll stop there, what is interesting is that China is now no longer the engine for global inequality reduction because it has become relatively rich, and by its fast growth, it is creating large gaps between herself and countries like Ethiopia, Sudan, Nigeria, and Congo, large African countries, and even Bangladesh, it is growing slower. So China, that we have normally taken as an engine for global inequality reduction, is no longer playing that role because it has become too rich. And if China continues being rich, there will be a time, and I think very soon, maybe within the next 10 years, that Chinese growth would become disequalizing. That's kind of a change in the perspective because we have gotten used to say, oh, well, China is reducing global inequality and global poverty. For global poverty, it will be still true, but it will not be true for global inequality. For the reduction in global inequality, we really need convergence of Africa. I cannot emphasize enough how crucial it is. So I would just say only 5 minutes, I think, because I think I've spoken too long about global inequality. If you allow me just 5 minutes for the effects within countries in individual Western countries. First of all, again, long-term view, you can see here for the UK, it's very nicely done here. You can actually see the increase of inequality very clearly from 1978. That was really the beginning of Margaret Thatcher. That increase continued, and then really in the last 15 years, the increase stopped. But it is certainly much higher than the level of inequality, which is actually on the vertical axis, is much higher than it was 30 years ago. But it's not the level of inequality of the 19th century. So when people say that rich countries are back to the 19th century, it is not true, simply because in the meantime, we have had lots of redistribution through the state, social transfers, and taxation. The market income before social transfers and taxation might be similar in terms of inequality to the way that it was in the latter part of the 19th century, or maybe 1913. But you cannot sort of disregard the large system of social welfare which has been sort of set in place after that period. But we have certain factors in rich countries that do tend to push inequality up. And these factors are the rising share overall, the rising share of income from capital versus labor, which has been documented in most rich countries or even in the middle income countries. And the problem with that is the inequality of capital income remains extremely high. As you can see here, the Gini of 0.9. And then if you have a rising share of a source, which means capital income, that is unequal, then it automatically translates into the higher interpersonal inequality. So we really have here a force that was almost automatic. If you have a big pie, which is your GDP, and that pie is divided between capitalists and workers, and the part of the pie which belongs to capitalists goes from about 1/3 to about 40%, that means that the source that is distributed much more unequally becomes more important. And that means that people at the top, because they tend to be people who have capital incomes, become richer. And that means that quasi-automatically you have an increase in inequality. So that actually is one of these automatic forces that pushes inequality up. I will skip this slide, which simply shows you that in all countries practically, whether rich or not rich, I have only rich countries here, but that you have the blue line, which shows you the Gini coefficient of capital income, and that line is significantly above the Gini coefficient of labor income. So that's something, it's a regularity that we find everywhere, practically any country. You can take China and you would find the same regularity. Actually, I should have brought the slide from China here as well. So that's, people who have capital income, or rather put it like that, capital income tends to be much more concentrated than labor income. And then another point, which I think is a new one that's actually was brought up in my book, Capitalism Alone, for the first time. And I gave it a name, sort of, as always, when you have a new phenomenon, you try to put some Greek name to it, homoplutia, meaning homo, equally, and same rather, and plutia, rich. Well, what does it shows that at the very top of the income distribution, you have an increasing share of people who are rich both in terms of capital income or property income, and they still work, so they have also very high salaries. You can imagine that what happens, we don't know exactly because we didn't need longitudinal data for that, but you can imagine that somebody has had very high salary. Let's suppose he's in financial industry, very high salary for 20 years, then has been able to save, and then out of this saving, he has actually created very significant financial assets, and has significant income from property. So you see on this graph that the percentage of people who are both rich in terms of labor and capital among the top decile in the United States has gone up from 15 to 30%. I want simply to emphasize what is not new here compared to the classical capitalism. In a classical capitalism, you would have rich capitalists at the top, but these rich capitalists would not be working. So, as you know, if you went to Budapest in 1910, you would have, of course, very rich capitalists, but they are not going to, they will be managing their own company, or maybe they will be going to horse races, but they would not be working, 10 hours a day as ophthalmologists or lawyers or something else. So they were rich capitalists with almost zero labor income. Well, nowadays, the people at the top would be both rich capitalists and rich workers. And that, of course, is a phenomenon which is much more present in rich countries. We see the percentages of people who are at the top, who are both rich capitalists and rich workers, is much higher in countries like Italy, Netherlands, US, Ireland. But in more classical capitalist countries like Mexico and Brazil, that number is much lower because of the fact that, as I said, for Budapest in 1910, they also have capitalists who are not actually working as workers. My last slide about the rich countries is going to show something that many of you know, and particularly since you're studying and you're young, you might know that even from personal experience, that there is an increasing assortative mating, which means that people with the same education and similar income levels tend to marry each other. There is nothing wrong with that. Actually, it shows the ability, generally, greater participation of women in the labor force and also in educational system. But it does have arithmetically an effect on increasing inequality. In other words, if two highly educated persons with high incomes in the future partner, they obviously increase inequality compared to a situation where each of them would marry somebody with lower income. And in this slide, you can see for the American men in 1970, the likelihood of them marrying a woman from the highest labor income bracket and the lowest income bracket was about the same. The highest income bracket is the orange line. The lowest income bracket is the blue line. Well, you notice what happened like 40 years ago. 40 years late, 50 years actually later, in 2017, the likelihood of marrying a woman from the top income brackets is now 3 times as high as marrying a woman from the lower income bracket. And the same thing, even more dramatically, is true for women. The ratio is 5 to 1. So that, as I said, is a positive development, but it does have the inequality increasing effect. And I would finish simply by highlighting the difficulty of dealing with inequality. And I intentionally showed these 2 last developments, homoplutia and homogamy, because if you look them in separation, there is nothing wrong with them. You would rather have a society where rich people are working than going to, horse racing and opera. So that seems to be actually a positive development. However, that development has also a kind of a not only class creation, but an elite creation of people who are invulnerable in terms of their income because they are actually both rich in labor terms and in capital terms, and whose way of life is very different from the rest of the population, and then who use these advantages over generations for their children. And then reduce social mobility. And of course, homogamy is also nothing wrong with it, but it does lead to an increase in inequality. So this is what I wanted to stop. There will be, I think, opportunity to talk about other things in the Q&A. But I like to finish with this ambiguity of inequality, because we sometimes believe that it's simple to solve it and it is quote unquote all bad, but it is actually sometimes very difficult to deal with. So thank you very much for the attention. Sorry that I took a little bit more than I promised, but that always happens.
Thank you, Professor Milanovic. This is amazing. Let me open the floor to questions, and I would ask colleagues to introduce themselves first and us asking later.
Thank you. I'm Peter Molnar, and thank you for the very nice talk. And my question is about climate change. So economic growth is usually understood as a way to reduce inequality and also as a way even to human happiness. So we sort of seem to worship economic growth. But how can we conceptualize it in the context of climate change? In other words, can we reconcile the concept, the positive concept of economic growth with our absolute necessity to stop climate change?
You know, this is an excellent question. I would be very brief. In my book, In Capitalism Alone, I spent very little time on climate change, and I was criticized for that. I do have a certain preference for growth simply because I look at the world globally and I see that without growth, people in the poor countries would remain poor. And I don't think that actually the fact that people in rich countries are rich, and of course they are, as you know, their footprint and their emissions of CO2 are, 5, 10, 20 times larger than people in the poor countries, that this is something which is sustainable. My hope is that we are able to, by decoupling, to continue growth with much less, emission. Some people argue that the decoupling alone is not sufficient. So if it is not sufficient, and it's something really that I don't know, I have not worked to tell you whether it is sufficient or not, but let's suppose that it's not sufficient. Then we have, and I really would like to see what you think of this, I think we have a very invidious or bad choice. If it's not sufficient, then either we have to freeze income distribution in the world as it is and keep 10 or 15% of people in poverty so that people in the rich countries can continue driving cars and, flying or eating meat. Or we have to argue that there should be a dramatic, and I want to say dramatic, decline in real incomes in rich countries. And this is essentially, again, arithmetic. If you might require in that case declines in real income in Europe and North America to the order of 40% or 50%. So I really cannot see any political force in those countries that would actually be ready to argue for your incomes being and my income being reduced in 1/2. And I think this is the conundrum, this is the problem, but I think we should be aware of that. So I'm not in favor, when I had discussions on the internet with people who just simply say, oh, we are all in the same boat, without acknowledging that we really are not in the same boat because our income levels are very different and the adjustment would be extremely different.
Wonderful. There is a follow-up question.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Michael Dorsch from Central European University. So I'm also, I guess, on the side of growth on this issue, but I'm not necessarily on the side of autocratic-led growth. So rise of China is happening, in an autocratic environment. And I guess, have you considered kind of trade-offs on that dimension as well? Thank you.
Yes, that's actually, this is also an excellent question. These are really probably 2 or 3 key areas. I mean, climate change and also political developments. This is a difficult question because I do not, in Capitalism Alone, do not fully address it. And let me say why. Because I believe that in many populations in the world, there is a willingness of a trade-off. Let me explain a little bit more. If you read Rawls, who actually, I was quite influenced by Rawls' theory of justice. In Rawls, you have lexicographical ordering of the objectives. And the first objective is human freedom. And then betterment of economic position comes, I think, as a second. And there is no trade-offs between the two. So in other words, you cannot justify lower freedom, political freedom, in order to get higher growth. And I think it's a nice lexicographical ordering, but I think in the real world, many people are implicitly or tacitly actually accepting that trade-off. And I think that, of course, that's what China has been doing in Vietnam, and before that, Singapore and Malaysia and Ethiopia and Rwanda have been accepting that trade-off, or people have been accepting trade-off. And so I'm not actually willing to say that that we have to necessarily exclude the existence of that trade-off. Even if we were to exclude it in some kind of a theoretical sense, it would still happen in real life. And I'm also somewhat, I don't want to go into that, maybe I will say that something at the very end. I'm also somewhat discouraged by the actual practice of democracy, not who gets elected only, but the lack of participation of people in the democratic process. And I think the lack of participation of people in the democratic process or any consultative process is to a large extent the result of very hyper-commercialized capitalism, which actually leaves you no time to do that. And to take an example, as you know, in the US, only 50% of the people participate in the elections. Most of the people don't participate in any other activities except on the internet and Twitter and so on. And even for the Trump last election where Trump lost, where you could not, even if you lived under the rock, you would have known that there is such an important election, the turnout was 60%. So 40% of people really don't care. And that's not really something which is very encouraging for democracy.
Further questions, colleagues? I had a question about migration, Branko. You said that migration will be a problem and that there will be a growing pressure, especially between Africa and Europe. Is it really a problem if we want to solve the conundrum of inequality?
No, excellent question. No, actually, migration would be a great way to solve inequality, global inequality. If you have people from Africa coming to Europe, their incomes would increase, by doubling, tripling, and so on. That global inequality would definitely go down. We know that actually, you do calculations, you know that actually people who migrate, whether look at Africans to Europe or you look Central Americans to the United States, their incomes go up. There is also a complementarity often between different types of labor. So it's not true that these foreigners who come, they just take away the jobs from the locals. There is a complementarity. There are no new jobs that locals can have. I mean, there are many things which are obvious. Like if you, in California, you would not have people who are doing lots of jobs. Many of them are actually manual jobs, but they are doing it at much lower cost. and they are making it possible actually for many people in California to have very pleasant living and not to have to pay somebody, for their garden $100 rather than, 50. So these are all good things. The problem is that, as we have seen in Europe, there is another issue. If people, as I said in my book, In Capitalism Alone, if people were avatars, so you just sort of move them with no social effects, no family connections, no ethnic or religious differences, then it would be the same. But the problem is that people are not avatars, so they come with their habits, their views, their mores, their religion, and that does create very clearly in Europe problems among a given section of the population. We cannot ignore it. We have Denmark now, which is practically closed country and have some kind of, without using that in a pejorative sense, but has some kind of national socialism. Nordic countries are actually getting much closer. England, to some UK, to some extent, has escaped the European Union because they didn't want these European migrants. So this is a real problem. Obviously, Le Pen in France. So we cannot close our eyes, and I think in that sense, it is a problem that is going to continue, even if Europe needs actually people from poorer countries, and particularly because Europe is aging, it will need them. But the adjustment, the assimilation is not going to be easy.
Thank you very much.
Zsolt, the Democracy Institute. Is the political organization of labor into unions, parties, and so on a major factor behind the degree of inequality, or is it just a minor secondary condition compared to deeper economic, cultural sources?
You really excellent question also. I have not worked actually with the role of trade unions. There are papers showing, believe it or not, papers by the IMF, actually 2 very good papers, showing that the weakening of the trade unions or lower bargaining power of labor is correlated with increase in inequality. And I think it makes sense if you, as actually you implicitly said that, if you have greater if you have a widening of the wage distribution because of the weaker labor and lower also minimum wage, that inequality will go up. The issue is that when you do all of these studies, I called it like inequality is overdetermined, because there are many things that can independently alone explain the rise of inequality. For example, the rise of inequality in the US could be explained by technological change, could be explained by the imports of Chinese goods and outsourcing of production to other countries, could be explained by the weakened trade unions, could be explained by the reduction in the marginal tax rates. So if you just take each of these elements, you might see actually, okay, I'm explaining the decline, but really they all should be seen together. And you can put it in a regression, but I think it is even more complicated because they were interdependent. Globalization led to the reduction of the marginal tax rates because you were afraid that other people would be actually able to take either your labor, skilled labor, or your capital. So you were pushed towards lower marginal tax rates. So I think it's very difficult to single out one element. But yes, I would agree that that element certainly did contribute, although I don't think it was the only element. And I don't know how important compared to the others.
Hello, my name is Hannah. I am an intern at the Democracy Institute. And some of the other panelists today talked about maybe translating academic speak to the common person and increasing the conversation between commoners like myself and academics. So I wanted to ask you a question that maybe would speak to people on my level who aren't quite as experienced with economics as you. I grew up in the US, and I know a lot of people who have become very disillusioned with capitalism, particularly in the US, not just with individuals who are very rich, but with companies that have so much control.
Right.
So I was wondering if you could speak to the people who maybe just want to throw out capitalism, because I see a lot of that on my social media, and they just want to completely give up on capitalism and move to some other system. So I wondered if you could maybe speak to that and some solutions that, or maybe, I don't know, some ideas that could happen in the US, which could maybe lower the extreme inequality of income. Thank you.
Okay, let me try to break it in two parts. Let me start with the last part because that's a little bit economistic part, and then I'll go back to more social part about socialism or capitalism. The reduction of inequality in the US, I think, is not something that we don't know how to do. And I think to a large extent, what is now in front of the US Congress is is realization after 30 years of Reaganomics and neoliberal policies that the US eventually has to do something. You know, we have had 10 years or maybe even 15 years of very much cheap talk about inequality. Finally, I think something is going to happen. It may not all happen, but certainly the direction is very clear. You have to have, I mean, one hopes that increase in taxation on the rich people, increase of taxation on capital, increase of taxation on corporations which have paid nothing, like for example, Amazon, cracking down on ability of US companies to actually play tax arbitration between different jurisdictions, increased expenditures on public education and infrastructure, and of course the new Green Deal. So really the major sort of action would be if this new policy sort of goes through Congress is really improvement in public education, which I think is one of the reasons why people, for example, in the US are so reluctant to get vaccinated. You know, when people tell me, oh, you know, they take it from like that anti-vaccination attitude came from the sky. No, it came from really very bad public education system that was unable to convince majority of people that it's a good thing. So it's actually the failure of education system. Similarly, it was the failure of the health system that the US is a country with largest numbers of people from COVID, and with now 750,000 people who died. You know, I compared, for example, the other day in my blog, actually, the death from COVID in the US to the death of from Cultural Revolution in China. Actually, deaths from COVID in the US are worse than deaths from Cultural Revolution in China, with the same proportion population. So I think people know what needs to be done to reduce inequality in the United States. And I think that some of the current measures might go some way towards that. I mean, we should not forget that when Reagan campaigned, he campaigned for the same taxation of capital and labor income. But nowadays, as you know, capital taxation in the US is like sometimes 12%, sometimes 20%, and labor, particularly if you have relatively high labor income, is 30%. So there are really anomalies there. Okay, now going back to your first question about capitalism, I know that many young people are very disenchanted, particularly in the US. Even the term capitalist, they really don't like it, and they have precarious jobs and all these other problems that I mentioned. Many of them, as you know, have large education, school debts that they cannot repay, which is also one anomaly. That's actually the only debt where the interest rate is high. You know, for other things you can borrow at, you know, until recently could borrow almost at a very low rate. So the problem, however, is, and that's actually why my book is called Capitalism Alone. The problem is that we do not have an alternative system currently that we can propose. We can propose all the things that I said before, but all these things are melioration of capitalism. And capitalism, in my book, is defined very simply as private ownerships of the means of production, hard labor, and decentralized coordination. We don't have plans that would, or sufficient support for the plans that would, for example, nationalize the means of production or give it to workers to manage. We don't have the plan where actually workers would no longer be hired, but would take it themselves to operate. So that would be a change in the system, but we don't have that. Maybe there will be some cooperative businesses that would appear, and they're actually, as you know, there are cooperative businesses in many countries, but they're marginal. So in that sense, I do not see a clear idea as to, when I come to the definition of capitalism, as what part of capitalism needs to be changed. Amelioration of capitalism certainly is desirable, and I think we have to fight for it, but we do not have a blueprint of another system in mind.
So I have another question. Hello, I'm Eva Fodor from the Democracy Institute. I am wondering how these inequalities intersect with gender. Whether or not the story that these graphs would look different if you separated men and women. I mean, you separate urban and rural, so I assume you could create similar graphs for men and women. Whether or not the stories would be similar or different, and whether or not there's difference across countries in their similarities. And I do realize that men and women are married, so when often to each other, and therefore it's difficult to disaggregate, for example, capital income. But there's an enough number of people by now, I assume. First of all, you talk about income, so that's an individual thing. And secondly, there's enough, households that are at least not the nuclear type of households. So it may be possible to measure this. So I'm also wondering whether or not there is data out there that would be able to assess that, or studies that really disaggregate inequalities on this scale.
Yes, actually, really excellent question. First, there are data there. For example, Luxembourg income study that I'm using most of my data from is large. I'm actually working with them. Largest source which compiles the household survey data from now 60 countries and has more than 500 surveys, and the variables, that's the most important part. The variables are harmonized. So when you really type variable social transfers or pensions or state pensions, in principle, that variable is defined the same in all 60 countries. Obviously, there are differences because countries have different rules, but broadly speaking, that's the same. Income certainly is the same. And their papers, if you go to their website, you would really find lots of papers that deal with gender and individual countries, mostly Western European countries, and breaking up the income of the household into part that was, for example, labor income is easy to break up, because you have information of who has received that labor income. Was it a man? Was it a woman? And then you can break it up. And then capital income, generally you don't have, but you can use what is called equal split, where you give the capital income to both of them. However, I really cannot do that at the world level because I don't have that information in such detail that I just explained to you for LIS. I do not have it for the entire world. We didn't come to discuss China, for example, and India. China has very little information that it provides. So you're very happy for China to have rural and urban dimensions and to have a given number. They sometimes don't even give you 100 percentile, sometimes they don't give you microdata. So it becomes much more difficult to do that globally for other countries. But I think for Europe, I think it's doable. For the United States, it's doable. And I think for most of Latin America, it's doable as well. But I have not seen the work which would actually include all of these countries. Let me just make a last point, and I always say that I'm a little bit disappointed that people actually really overdo intra-European differences, because they really need to move a little bit further. Like Latin America has very good data sets, and the same thing can be done for Latin America. So that's the answer. I think technically it can be done, not covering necessarily the entire world, but significant parts of the world. Africa would be difficult to cover. In Africa, it's difficult to cover because oftentimes you have consumption data. So you don't have income data, you don't know who brought what in terms of income. Was it a wife, was it a husband? Families are very large, so it becomes very difficult.
Would you take one more question, Professor Milanovic?
Yeah, I can take even more.
Wonderful, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, David Karras from Democracy Institute. So in light of the relative marginalization of Western middle classes and the redistribution of wealth from the West to basically Asia, China especially, would you see the type of Trumpian protectionist, anti-globalist movements as kind of like foreshadowing a more structural trend in the West in relation to globalization, and maybe a shift towards defending multilateralism, actually shifting to China and furthering the interest of Chinese middle classes instead? Thank you.
Yes, I do actually. Really, really excellent question. Let me just first say that when you started speaking, there is one word that I didn't like when you spoke of redistribution. It was not the redistribution. It was simply the fact that China was growing faster than the US. So it's not like China took something that the US had. So I knew that that's not what you meant, but the word redistribution implies that I contribute something and then through taxation somebody takes it away from me and gives it to you. So China simply did better than the US. Now there is a certain structural feature there. You notice that even, and I have now the numbers which I didn't show you for the most recent period before COVID. Let me show you this this problem of the middle class, lack of middle class growth. Actually here, 2000 up to 2013, no improvement for Western middle classes. That problem remains. That problem remains when I extend this graph to 2018. So this problem is, I think, a structural problem linked with globalization that we have. And I hate to be the bearer of the bad news, but I think it will become worse. And the reason why it's going to become worse is because during COVID, we have realized the power of online, which we are doing right now, which can be used to hire much cheaper labor for many tasks in faraway places. So some tasks that have not been outsourced in the past, because although we did have technology, but it was not used, I'm sure that after COVID would be really outsourced. You would have actually people in Bangladesh or India and Burma, not only replying to your phone calls when you when you want to make a reservation for United Airlines or something, they would be actually doing many other tasks. And that would essentially mean another pressure on Western middle classes' income. And I think it is a structural feature, which is due to globalization. Now, if you believe it is a structural feature, then you have the question, how am I going to improve the position of the Western middle class? And as I said, one way was the Trumpian way, is to try to really change the nature of globalization, which I see, for example, in the US insistence on property rights. So in other words, to find any way that you would compensate losses that you would have made either in outsourcing or labor, and impose tariff rates on China and do everything else that you can in order to gain something from, gain more from globalization. The other possibility is that you redistribute within the country. As I said before, take away from the top 1% and do redistribution nationally. And I think that actually, if you look at what's happening now, I think that basically what the Trump administration is doing both. The Trump administration has not removed tariffs on China. It might, but it has not done it so far. And of course, it is trying now to do some redistribution within the United States, which I think is a very good thing to do. But trying to beggar the third world countries in order to maintain the level of living of the Western middle class is really a big issue. Even I think ethically, it's also a big issue that one has to address. But Adam Smith said that more than 2 centuries ago. He said if one were cosmopolitan, he should basically look equally to all nations and sort of be very happy, for example, if the nation of France, which is much more numerous than the nation of England, would get better off. But he would be then considered as a very poor Englishman. So that's basically the issue that we have here.
Wonderful. Let's finish on this note. Thank you very much once again. Let's thank Professor Milanovic in the usual manner.